Welcome back to the deep dive. You know we love getting your input, and wow, did you guys send us some fascinating stuff this time?
Yeah, some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, a lot on the global economy and the future of finance. Articles, expert opinions, like you're all really trying to figure out what's coming next.
And who can blame them?
Right. So, to help us sort through it all, we're joined by expert speaker.
It's great to be here.
Now, what really jumps out at you from all of this?
Well, it's kind of hard to miss the convergence of several big trends,
Hmm.
Like we've got this rising national debt thing, shifting global power dynamics. We even might be seeing like a potential crisis of confidence in those traditional financial systems we're all used to.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. But we thought it'd be good to maybe focus today on how these trends are impacting gold markets.
Great place to start,
Yeah. And then we can look at what that could mean for your own financial decisions.
for sure.
So one of the things you flagged for me was this piece from Francis Hunt.
Oh, yeah. Hunt's always got something interesting to say.
Yeah, he's a pretty well-known market analyst, and he's stirring up some talk with his predictions.
Right.
He's saying that basically we're right in the middle of what he calls a debt-based collapse, which is,
Catchy.
yeah. And he's not super optimistic about the U.S. economic situation either. Can you maybe give us like the rundown on what he's saying?
Okay, so Hunt's main argument is that the U.S. is issuing debt. Well, at a rate we've seriously never seen before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he thinks this is going to lead to the devaluation of the U.S. dollar.
Right.
Full-on devaluation, maybe even decades of economic stagnation.
Okay, I think a lot of people hear that and think, well, governments borrow money all the time, right? Like, what's so different now?
Right. Well, that's exactly the point Hunt's trying to make. It's the sheer scale of this. He gives this example that's pretty mind-blowing. The U.S. government recently issued, get this, $500 billion in debt in just 6 days.
Wait, 500 billion?
Billion with a B.
That's, wow. Okay, so yeah, that's not just like regular borrowing.
Exactly. And Hunt says that's a huge red flag, that the government's just not managing its finances well. And he thinks this could easily snowball into a way bigger crisis.
500 billion in 6 days. It's hard to even like picture that much money. But I get your point. This isn't just business as usual. He's seriously sounding the alarm.
Big time. He even compares what's happening to the period after the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
The U.S. had massive debt then, too. And Hunt argues that the government ended up taking extreme measures to just devalue that debt.
Huh.
And he's seeing some pretty worrying parallels to what's going on right now.
So not a great picture, but I remember from this piece, Hunt's not all doom and gloom, right? He does offer a potential solution.
Gold. Oh, yeah, he's definitely a gold bug.
Yeah. And he doesn't mince words. He calls it the ideal tool for navigating all this economic turbulence we're talking about.
Yeah, and to understand why he's so into gold, we have to kind of look at what he sees as like the problem with the current system.
Okay, I'm listening.
All right, so he points to the fact that the U.S. dollar's influence is shrinking as the world's reserve currency. He says that's a huge deal.
It makes sense that would have some serious ripple effects.
Yeah. And then he points to the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and how they're rising as like a challenge to that whole Western economic dominance we've been used to.
And I'm guessing he doesn't think those traditional safe havens like bonds and equities are going to cut it anymore.
Nope. He thinks they're getting way riskier in this climate, like way riskier.
So it's not just about the U.S. economy then, right? It's this whole global shift in power dynamics, too.
Exactly. Hunt even makes this comparison. He contrasts this whole power transition to like when the British pound handed things over to the U.S. dollar back in the day.
Interesting.
Yeah, he says back then it was more of a smooth handover.
Yeah.
Like pretty amicable.
Right.
But this time, he thinks it's much more hostile.
Okay, so we've got this debt bubble thing, a potential currency crisis brewing, A&D, a global power struggle, all going on at once. It's a lot. I can definitely see why he's suggesting people turn to gold. But what does this actually mean for, like, everyday people who are listening right now? Like, people who are just trying to figure out how to invest their money.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because this power shift, it's going to have big implications for where we put our money and how. Hunt predicts we're going to see a big jump in wealth taxes, especially on things like property. Governments are going to be scrambling to meet their financial obligations somehow.
So basically he's saying, brace yourselves, the government might come knocking for a much bigger slice of your pie. That's not exactly comforting.
It's not the most cheerful news, no. But he does offer some advice. He suggests people start looking beyond those traditional markets. Explore opportunities in places with like emerging economies, where there's more potential for growth, And maybe the tax burden isn't so heavy?
So it's not just about hunkering down and waiting for the worst to happen. It's about getting proactive and looking for those new opportunities too.
Exactly. And Hunt's really clear that acting early is super important. He compares it to like a sinking ship. The longer you wait to grab a lifeboat, the more crowded it gets and the fewer options you've got.
Yeah.
He really believes the people who recognize these warning signs and start adjusting their financial strategies now, they're going to be in a much stronger position. He even uses this phrase, it's kind of stark, expert speaker, cannot. He calls it thinking the unthinkable.
Yeah, which, I mean, it can be a little unnerving, right? But I think his point is we got to be ready to challenge those assumptions about how the world works, especially when things are shifting so much.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to navigate a storm with an outdated map. Thinking you're on the right course, but you're headed straight into danger.
Totally.
And Hunt says a lot of people are stuck in this hyper-normality mindset. It's like thinking tomorrow's going to be just like today, only with more time added on.
Right, just an extension of today.
Right. But what if it's not? He thinks we're on the verge of this massive shift, a period where entire decades happen in weeks. It's not slow and steady change anymore. We got to be mentally ready for those unexpected rapid shifts and adapt our finances to handle them.
So less smooth sailing, more like batten down the hatches.
More like that, yeah. He thinks we're facing a potential economic collapse, where the systems we rely on just stop working the way we expect. He uses this analogy, expert speaker, Kant. Imagine stacking chips higher and higher. You can go pretty high, but eventually the whole structure becomes unstable and the whole thing comes crashing down.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
That's what he thinks is happening with our economy right now.
So I guess the question is, are we adding one too many chips to the pile? And if so, what can we do to prepare for that collapse?
Right. That's the big question.
Hmm.
He thinks a lot of people are just in denial about how serious this is. They're waiting for like undeniable proof before they do anything. But he's warning by the time that proof comes around, it might be too late.
Yeah, it's like that whole thing in trading where they say waiting for confirmation usually means you miss the best opportunities. But it also means you might be taking on more risk too. Tough call.
Totally. And that's where Hunt's idea of being an early mover comes in. He compares it to leaving a sinking ship. The longer you wait, the more crowded the lifeboats get and the fewer options you'll have.
And he even applies that analogy to like leaving the US right. He's pretty vocal about potentially relocating to countries with better economic conditions.
Yeah, he is. And it's important to remember that's just his perspective. It's a controversial one, too. Not everyone agrees with him. He's saying that the U.S. is going downhill while other nations are on the rise. He's all about go where you're treated best, emphasizing personal sovereignty in this changing world.
That's a pretty big decision, though, uprooting your life and moving to another country.
For sure, it's not something to take lightly. But he's suggesting it might be worth thinking about, especially if you're worried about the long-term economic outlook in the U.S. He even suggests looking at countries that we used to call second world or third world. He points out a lot of them are growing really fast and have some amazing opportunities for entrepreneurs.
So thinking outside the box and being open to new possibilities, even if they sound a little unconventional.
Yeah, exactly. Hunt thinks those old labels and hierarchies just don't apply anymore. The flow of money and opportunity is shifting, and the people who are willing to adapt and ride that wave, they could really benefit.
Okay, I like that analogy. So with all this talk of economic storms and sinking ships, what are some practical things people can do to navigate all this uncertainty? I mean, it's one thing to talk about these global trends, but what can people actually do to protect themselves and their money?
Well, based on what Hunt's saying, it seems like reducing your reliance on debt is huge. He specifically says, pay off those credit cards, personal loans, anything with a variable interest rate. Because as interest rates go up, those debts are going to get harder and harder to manage.
He doesn't really sugarcoat what happens if you're in a lot of debt when inflation is high and the economy is stagnant.
Nope. He compares it to running an obstacle course while you're overweight, sick A&D, high on drugs.
Not a winning strategy.
Definitely not. His point is debt makes you incredibly vulnerable when the economy's turbulent.
Whereas having that financial flexibility gives you options, the ability to make moves when you need to.
Exactly. He's a big advocate for building up a cash reserve, not just for emergencies, but to be able to jump on investment opportunities that might pop up.
And of course, he's always talking about diversifying your assets and especially investing in gold.
Oh, he's totally convinced gold is the HE safe haven in this kind of environment. He argues that it holds its value no matter what happens with fiat currencies or the stock market. And he's not talking about a small amount either. He's suggesting putting a substantial chunk of your portfolio into gold.
He even mentions how every tick of a cent in the gold price makes a real difference in his own portfolio.
So yeah, he's putting his money where his mouth is. But, it's important to remember this is just one perspective. There are other viewpoints on how gold fits into a diversified portfolio. It's always a good idea to do your own research and talk to a financial advisor before making any big investment decisions.
Right. Always good advice. So we've got debt, cash reserves, and gold. What other practical advice does he give for navigating this economic shift?
He talks about thinking globally, considering investment opportunities beyond where you live right now. He really highlights the potential of those emerging markets. He says they offer high growth potential and relatively low taxes.
But he's not just saying chase the highest returns without thinking about the risks, right? He really stresses understanding the political and economic landscape of any country you're considering investing in.
Oh yeah, for sure. He even suggests maybe relocating your business or even where you live to a country with a better economic outlook. Says it could be a strategic move.
That's a pretty bold suggestion, not one to be taken lightly. But it really underscores that idea that we need to be open to challenging our assumptions and looking at options that might have seemed crazy a few years ago.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the world's changing fast, and we have to be proactive in adapting our strategies to stay ahead of the curve. Hunt argues that traditional path to building wealth, get a good education, climb the corporate ladder, invest in stocks and bonds that might not be as reliable as it used to be.
So he's advocating for a more entrepreneurial approach, one that embraces risk and goes after opportunity wherever it is.
That's a good way to put it. He's basically saying that in this new economic landscape, the rewards will go to the people who are willing to think differently, challenge the status quo, and take calculated risks. He uses this analogy like expert speaker Kant. He talks about the difference between paddling upstream and paddling with the flow of money.
So instead of fighting the current, ride the wave.
Exactly. He says it's much easier to reach your financial goals if you're aligned with those major economic trends instead of fighting against them.
So the question is, where is the money flowing?
According to Hunt, it's flowing away from the West and towards the East, towards those emerging economies that are experiencing rapid growth and innovation. He even goes as far as to say the next generation of tech giants might not come from Silicon Valley. They might come from countries like China or India.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially with all the tension between the U.S. and China right now.
It is. But it shows how the global economic landscape is becoming more complex and interconnected. And it goes back to Hunt's main message. We need to be adaptable, open to new ideas, and willing to challenge what we think we know about how the world works. But it's not just about adapting to these big global changes. Hunt also has some interesting thoughts on how this affects different generations.
How so?
He says that younger generations are dealing with a much different economic reality than their parents or grandparents. He talks about the baby boomer generation as being this huge, influential demographic, but they're getting older and leaving the workforce. And he suggests that's going to create a big economic vacuum as younger generations try to fill their shoes and maintain that same level of prosperity.
Yeah, I've heard that worry before, that younger generations might not be as economically successful as their parents were.
Right. And Hunt uses this pretty stark term to describe what the economic future might look like for a lot of young people. He talks about serfdom.
Right.
Like they could get trapped in this cycle of low wages, high taxes, and limited opportunities.
Wow.
It's a pretty pessimistic view, but it does raise some important questions about whether our current economic model is sustainable in the long run.
So with all these warnings and predictions, is there any reason to be optimistic? Does Hunt offer any hope for the future?
He does, actually. He says that, yeah, there are definitely challenges, but there are also some huge opportunities for the people who are ready to grab them.
Yes.
He's big on entrepreneurship, innovation, and adaptability being the keys to success in this new economic landscape.
So it's not about hiding out and waiting for the storm to pass. It's about getting out there and finding ways to thrive even when things are chaotic.
That's it. He even compares this whole situation to what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of new possibilities opened up for the people who were willing to embrace the change and take some risks.
That's a really interesting comparison. Like, even when there's a ton of uncertainty, there's always a chance for growth and renewal. It's about finding those opportunities and being brave enough to go after them.
I think that's a great way to put it. And to bring it all back to you listening right now, I think the main thing to remember from Hunt's perspective is this. We're living in a time of crazy economic uncertainty like we haven't seen before. Those old rules might not work anymore, And we need to be ready to change our thinking and our strategies, not just to survive, but to actually thrive in this new landscape.
Yeah, it's a lot to absorb, but I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. It's about taking a step back, looking at the big picture, and then figuring out how to navigate it all. It can be a little scary, but it can also be really empowering.
I totally agree. This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. The effects of a debt-based collapse could be massive. They could touch everything from our investments to just our daily lives. Any last thoughts for our listeners as they try to make sense of all this?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is how important it is to stay informed and be proactive. It's easy to get caught up in just getting through each day and hoping for the best. But what Hunt's saying reminds us we can't afford to just sit back and do nothing.
Yeah, definitely. Don't just rely on the headlines or whatever's on the news. Dig a little deeper, do some research, and really think critically about the information you find. Consider different perspectives and come to your own conclusions. This period of economic uncertainty, it's got challenges for sure, but it also has opportunities. By staying informed and taking action, you could set yourself up to not just ride out the storm, but maybe even come out stronger on the other side.
That's great advice. It's easy to feel overwhelmed with all the information out there, but I think you nailed it. Stay curious, keep learning, and be ready to adapt. That's what the deep dive is all about, helping you make sense of this complicated world we live in. Thanks for joining us.